And the problem is if you rely on your fraction button on your calculator to do numbered fractions, then when you get to polynomials, you don't know what to do because you don't have a variable button for your fractions on your calculator. So it's just understanding that there are basically 3 scenarios with fractions: adding them, multiplying them, and dividing them. That's it. How do you add them? You add the numerators, putting them over the common denominator. Sometimes you got to get a common denominator. That's the couple lessons coming down the road. So Alex, test tomorrow, you see polynomial fractions, you got to get a common denominator. Same concept, you got to factor the denominator and then multiply a fraction by a form of 1 to get that common denominator. All right? That's adding. We'll deal with that a couple days because that's the more difficult one. Multiplying, this should be your brain thought. All right, I'm multiplying fractions, top times top, bottom times bottom. Reduce before I multiply. So that's what we're going to do with polynomials. Top times top, bottom times bottom, but we're going to reduce before we multiply. Division, you should be thinking invert the divisor, the second fraction, flip it, do its reciprocal, and then top times top, bottom times bottom, reduce before you multiply. That's it. That's not a lot. That's 3 things. Add the numerators, put them over a common denominator, thing number 1. Multiplying, top times top, bottom times bottom, thing number 2, and oh yeah, reduce before you multiply. And thing number 3, dividing fractions, flip the second one, invert the second one, take the reciprocal of the second one, it's all the same thing, and multiply top times top, bottom times bottom. 3 things. But you got to remember those 3 things, and if you do, you're in good shape. So what's this one? AC over BD, right? Top times top, bottom times bottom. None of the variables divide out, so there was no reducing. It's just top times top, bottom times bottom. It's all that's trying to say to you is top times top, bottom times bottom. And then to divide, you're supposed to remember, okay, I'm going to change the division sign to a multiplication symbol, and I'm going to invert the second fraction. And then it's just a multiplication problem. Right now we're right back to where we were with multiplication. And we're going to do top times top, bottom times bottom, but we're going to reduce before we multiply. Just don't reduce here. You can't reduce before you invert. Can't do any reducing until you have that second fraction flipped. And that's it. That's all. That's all you're doing. That's all there's to it. Now we got to deal with polynomials in the midst, which means we got to factor, but that's all we're doing. So let's go through a couple situations. I'll try to build a progression to get us where we need to go. All right, so the first scenario is just straight multiplication, right? Okay, so just like the other day when I said be careful that you don't cross off the wrong things. So don't write this. Again, if I had something like this, x over x plus 2 times, I don't know, how about a x plus 4, probably not a good example here. Let me go like this. Let's just go simple. 2 over 3x. Can you take this 2 and that 2 and divide them out? And the answer is no, because this 2 is tied into the x. They're one thing. They're a binomial. That you've got to know. That you've got to remember. You can't cross out those 2's. What about this x and this x? Can we divide them out? And the answer is yes, because this x, this is a 3 times an x. The x is free to be divided out with that other x, and that you can do. So just be careful there. In what I see students doing is crossing out all kinds of stuff that they can't cross out. So for example, you can't take this x squared and cross off one of them because of that x on the bottom. Because again, that x is tied into that negative 3. Right? Just don't do that, because if you do that, you're going to be in a mess. So it's all about factoring. So you look at the top numerator on the left, right? Right here. and you say, okay, that's pretty much one term, so I'll just deal with that later. You go to the right and you say, oh, that binomial is a difference 2 squares, so go ahead and factor that. I'll do it as you do it. Right, and everybody said, okay, 2 parentheses, plus in the middle 1, minus in the middle of the other, square root of the front in the front, square root of the back in the back, and you get x plus 3 over x minus 3. So then I start working my denominators, and I see the bottom denominator, nothing to do to that on the left, but I look on the right, and I remember the first law of factoring, factor out common factors first, and I say, oh, there's a common x I can get out. So I'm going to factor out that common x. And now that everything's factored, now I'm ready to reduce, right? So most people will see the x minus 3 quantity and x minus 3 quantity, and that'll go, right? We did the whole thing. Took the whole x minus 3. They're gone. On this one, there's only one thing left, right? And that's right here. You got an x squared with an x on the bottom. So again, an x squared is an x times x, so one of them are gone, and there's one left. Agreed? And there's nothing else we can do. There's nothing else left. So you just write your top, and again, we're going to leave it, this is weird, we're doing multiplying of fractions, and we're going to leave it unmultiplied. But we're just going to do it for time's sake. In other words, you know, when it comes to assessing whether you understand the concepts, we're trusting that you know how to multiply. We've done other things to assess that. We got to now know if you know how to do the whole concept of the fractions. So we're going to have you leave it in factored form for time's sake. Because if you take the time every time to multiply these things out, and this one's not so bad, but some of them get complex, it'll eat too much time, and we're more concerned about you knowing the concept. So for that reason, we're leaving it factored, though technically you should multiply it out. So technically, it's not really finished. And look, all of this is a means to an end. This is really all to lead us to equations. And then you'll get a final answer, and you'll finish the things out. That's where we're heading toward equations. Okay, so that's the first one, multiplication. Again, we reduced before we multiplied, and then we did top times top, bottom times bottom. 3 times x plus 3, and then the bottom was just an x minus 2. All right, second one, you got division. So, you know, I don't know how you do them. The first thing I do is just invert everything. So I put my x squared plus 5x minus 6 on the top, and my x squared plus 2x on the bottom, right? So you got to flip it. So I put the bottom on the top on the bottom. You got to do it to the second fraction. You can't do it to the first. And then again, it's factoring, right? The left fraction's already factored, so I got to do the right. So this is trial and error. It's a trinomial. Front's got to be x and x. And we're going to try not to give you really hard things to factor, because, you know, then it's just a time thing again. All right, a negative 6, but again, you're always looking at your middle term, and you're always thinking the outers plus the inners equaling the middle term, right? That's what we're thinking. We've already reviewed factoring a ton. So hopefully you say, how about positive 6 and negative 1? That's going to give me a positive 6x outers and a negative 1 inners to give me that positive 5 middle, right? And then the bottom, for some reason, I don't know why, but a lot of times students miss factoring out that common factor. Don't miss that. Common x on the bottom, factor it out. Man, who wrote this problem? What a pain. There's not a whole lot going on here. Brother. What in the world? Should have made that 6 a positive. Ah, that would have been good. Oh well. Such is life. So the x minus 1s go. And that's it on this one. So if you write it like this, are we good to go? Is that good to go on the top? What do we got to do? You got to have a parentheses, right? Because it's the left fractions numerator times the right fractions, right? You need a parentheses there. Again, technically you would multiply it all out, but we're not multiplying for time's sake. And the bottom is an x times an x plus 2. I mean, that's all we're doing on these. That's it. Not a big deal. Not a big revelation. Top times top, bottom times bottom. Invert before you multiply. All right, so what if they ask you for excluded values? I got a couple more here. Number 2 says simplify, leave in factored form, and state excluded values. All right, I'm gonna let you guys do this one, and if I'll leave the screen on, so if you get stuck, you can see what I'm doing. But I'm gonna try to delay. So go ahead and do A, and don't forget as well to state any excluded values. And the key is going to be your timing as to if you're quick at your factoring or not. All right, so those divide out. Is that it? Nope, an x plus 2 divides out. And my top is an x minus 7. Don't need a parentheses because the fraction bar is the grouper. And x minus 3 times 2x plus 3. All right, so you should have ended up with an x minus 7 over an x minus 3 times a 2x plus 3. How many got that correct? Okay. And again, you know, how good you are at factoring is a key to this whole chapter. So you got to be able to factor, and you got to, if you haven't worked out your factoring bugs yet, you got to work them out. My advice is, if you want help from me, go back to HCS math class and look at Algebra 1 when they factored, which is chapter 10, because I take time and explain it more fully. But you know, you got to get your factoring and trinomials down, otherwise it's going to, excluded values. So we're looking at, just so you're clear, before you cross anything out, is your excluded values. So after it's inverted and before you divide anything out. So x cannot be, the first binomial would be a negative 2. Again, x plus 2 equals 0, x equal negative 2. The second binomial would give you a 3. The third, move the 3, you get a negative 3, move the 2, negative 3 halves. And the fourth, positive 3 halves are the excluded values. So negative 2, 3, negative 3 halves, 3 halves. Again, you're just setting each binomial equal to 0 or each term equal to 0 and solving. So negative 2, 3, negative 3 halves, 3 halves. Any questions on the excluded values? Anybody? Okay, so one more. So if you look at that, do you say, I'm stuck? Or do you say, piece of cake? Well, maybe not piece of cake, but I know what to do. Right? Right, do you know what to do? All right, so go ahead and do it. I'm going to leave the screen on. And so if you're not sure what to do, you can watch. And I'll go through the process here on the screen. Windows. That's all gone. Just factoring and dividing out common factors, right? Factor out common factors first. I'm going to do my excluded values first before I cross them out. 1, 6. Don't forget the 0. And then -2. Right? 0 comes from really just the x. Okay, divide out common terms. All right, let's get rid of the x minus 1. Let's get rid of the x plus 2. And oh yeah, this 6. Those 3's can divide out. What's left on the top? Just a 2. What's left on the bottom? X times x minus 6. Which again is x squared minus 6x, and that's a simplistic one. I would take the answer either way that way, but again, we're leaving them factored for time's sake. And again, excluded values, 1 from the first binomial, 6 from the second, 0 from the x times the quantity, and then -2 from that. Any questions on that? So it's factoring, reduce before you multiply. Do not multiply out and then try to reduce. That would be a major catastrophe. All right, you got 12 minutes left. Prime time, get some stuff done. All right, I didn't give you a ton of these because the same thing over and over again, so try to focus on the ones you've got.